Well, as normal, we begin with history. After all, I want our talented and bright young students to feel comfortable. Not quite in the classroom, but we'll see. This morning's Hebrew Old Testament text dates back from the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE, or BC. I'm sure you know. BCE is the newer appellation of before the Common Era, and BC before Christ. Keep in mind that what I'm about to read predates Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle by centuries. The Hebrews, the Jews, in the early part of this Isaiah writing, are being warned about being overtaken by foreign enemies because of their unfaithfulness. Keep in mind that we're talking about this one only God. This God was a moral God with high expectations for humanity. Well, sure enough, by the way, there are 66 chapters in this book, okay? Sure enough, Israel and Judah lose their sovereignty. They are invaded. And by the time we get to this Isaiah chapter 46, they are now under the thumb of the Babylonian Empire, and many of the Jews have been taken out of Judah into exile into Babylonia, to Babylon. They are bereft of their homeland. They are foreigners in a strange land that they don't want to be in. Chapters 40 through 55 is a hopeful, comforting section. There are promises of God delivering them. Yes, they disobeyed, but God forever loves them. And what we're now experiencing in the middle part of the book is that God will deliver them and they're going to get to go home. They are being reminded of who they were and are of the God that enacts restoration and justice. So, just a few verses here. Keep that in mind as you hear these verses. Remember, they're being told, the ones in exile, remember the former things of old, where they were, what they were taught. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, from the ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country, I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it. Sure enough, in the latter part of this Isaiah book, the Judeans, the Jews, are returned to their land. Over and over and over again and again and again, in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, they are reminded to remember, to know and teach their history, their culture to the young. Now, for the New Testament, Matthew's Gospel depicts, interestingly, Jesus as the new Moses. The structural similarities between them, they're amazing if one pays attention to the actual composition of Matthew. So Jesus is at the Sermon on the Mount here in this part, speaking out in the open air just above the Sea of Galilee. It's a beautiful area. I've been there 3 times. Just magnificent. Just as Moses went up to the mountain to receive the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, Jesus now is up in the mountainous areas above the Sea of Galilee. These few verses give witness to the precious laws, the commandments, of the affinity and continuity between Jesus and Moses. Jesus, you'll hear, isn't negating the law, the old stuff, okay? Not at all. But he speaks of fulfilling them, that is, for Christians. Listen for continuity and novelty in this traditional contemporary moral injunction idea. We read in Matthew 5, seeing the crowds, Jesus went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth, and he taught them, saying, and I'm only going to read a little piece of it. He's out looking at these friends, people he doesn't know. You have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. Actually, the word kill, the better word is murder. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool shall be liable to hellfire. Interesting. But I say to you, you have heard that it is said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You've heard that? But I say to you, do not resist one who is evil, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him also the other. And if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Back at that time, the Romans that were there over in charge of Israel, okay, there were laws that the Jews, hey, a Roman asked you to do this, you do it. And Jesus is saying, don't just go 1 mile, that was the law, go 2 miles. Give to him who begs from you, and do not refuse him who would borrow from you. Amen. Just smattering here. Again, we are so pleased and honored that you are with us this morning, grateful that you are sharing your beautiful voices, those great smiles. Oh, you just all look so great. You really are. And I mean this, and I think I'm going to speak for you. Okay? You inspire us, seeing all these young folks together singing, and just, oh, that's so wonderful. And we also know, that you have sacrificed your early Sunday morning study time for us. We very much appreciate that. Thank you for your sacrifice. The Lord will remember this. I think Mr. Davis might. Let's see. Today there is great concern within our society about our lack of knowing our cultural history, our history of Western civilization. American historian, many of you probably have read him, David McCullough, wrote some years back, history is who we are and why we are the way we are. It's kind of a simple sentence, but it kind of says so much. He viewed history as fundamental to identity, encouraging people to see history as a mirror that reflects social, societal values, beliefs, and transformations that have shaped the modern culture that we live in. History is important. Contemporary American historian Professor Gelzo at Princeton University's James Madison program has declared this, quote, history is a conversation, not just about what happened, but about what it means to us now. How do we integrate in the now? Knowing our history enables us to engage our history, finding meeting points of relevance and meaning for our current lives. There's one more historian that I want to share a little bit about with you this morning. His writings and recent intellectual and spiritual journey, they are relevant to our historical needs today. In sharing ever so briefly this morning a portion of his journey, I trust you will keep in mind within the bulletin today, keep in mind the biblical text that we have heard this morning from Psalm 78, from Exodus 20, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, Isaiah 46, and Matthew 5. This all is meant to gel together from our Judeo-Christian tradition. The historian's name is Tom Holland. No, he's not the actor. Do you know the actor, Tom Holland? Okay, just check. He is well respected in his field. He has published many volumes on ancient Roman history and more. And in his 2019 book, by the way, this book I highly recommend. I've said this to the congregation before, okay? Dominion. This is the name of the book. Dominion. How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. In his preparing and writing for this volume, and he's written numerous volumes in ancient history, okay? This is where things began to change in his life, in his thinking, his rethinking about history. And here's a person that has delved into ancient history much, much more deeply than any of us probably ever will. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about him to tell you about the concern that I'm bringing up this morning. He talks about as a boy, he was fascinated with dinosaurs, okay? That's where they come in the sermon today, okay? You might have wondered, okay? What a boy. And by the way, what boy, and maybe girl also, when you're young, you're not fascinated with dinosaurs, okay? Later on, you can tell me, no, you've always hated them or something. But I know I loved them. I had a bunch of them, playing all the time with them there, okay? Well, when he went to church in the mid-1970s, he was 6 years old, by the way, at this point. He got there and he viewed a Sunday school illustration that depicted on the very first page of this Sunday school, this 6-year-old, okay, depicted in illustration, Adam and Eve with a brachiosaurus next to them. Now, he was very precocious. As any 6-year-old would do, he went to his Sunday school teacher and said, "This is a mistake." 6 years old. But to no avail, she didn't listen. He notes that this was the beginning of him beginning to question what he was being taught in church about the Christian faith. Well, he says he remained a believer, but with reservations. But as he grew, his interest, even within the biblical context through Sunday school and such, his interests were on the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Romans especially. Favorites were the Olympians, Apollo, Athena, Dionysius. These deities and lesser gods were, he said, as he was reading that, again, he's very young, but he's getting older, he says, these people, these other people, and these gods, they're really enjoying themselves. Not like that God who was laying down laws and commandments in the Bible. He decides to study classical antiquity. No surprise. He enjoyed the company of Julius Caesar, was fascinated over Sparta and Rome. These living, and these are his words, these living apex predators were like the giant carnivores with their terrifying natures. That's what was catching his attention. Now here's where the change begins. I'm going to quote him. He's going to be part of this sermon this morning because he says it so beautifully, powerfully. Quote, "The longer I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, the more alien and unsettling I came to find it. The value of those whose people had practiced a peculiarly murderous form of eugenics and trained their young to kill uppity intermention, those are the socially inferior. Young to kill these socially inferior by night were nothing, he said, that I recognized as my own, nor were those of Caesar, who was reported to have killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more." He's beginning to wonder. "It was not just the extremes of callousness that I came to find shocking, but the lack of a sense that the poor or the weak might have any intrinsic value. As such, the founding conviction of the Enlightenment that it owed nothing to the faith into which most of its greatest figures had been born increasingly came to seem to me unsustainable." He's going through a spiritual, intellectual crisis. He quotes Voltaire. Every sensible man, says Voltaire, every honorable man must hold the Christian sect in horror. That's part of the Enlightenment. But Holland is beginning to say, wait, there's something wrong. He goes on, rather than acknowledge that his ethical principles might, referring to Voltaire, his ethical principles might owe anything to Christianity, he preferred to derive them from a range of other sources, not just classical literature, but Chinese philosophy and his own powers of reason. Yet, he goes on, Voltaire, in his concern for the weak and oppressed, was marked for more enduringly by the stamp of biblical ethics than he cared to admit, or maybe that he even realized. Voltaire's defiance of the Christian God, in a paradox that was certainly not unique to him, drew on motivations that were, in part at least, recognizably Christian. So much of this has not been remembered. Holland was experiencing an epiphany, an awakening of the true movement of history. This was on historical and empirical grounds. Holland was realizing that the crucified God's, that's Christ, okay? The crucified God's teachings and life were the trajectory of our Western world's morality, not ancient Rome. Examples: the concept of self-sacrifice, Romans in antiquity, the leadership, okay, the thought process, those who controlled. Romans celebrated the willingness to sacrifice for the glory of Rome, but Christianity introduced the different concept of sacrifice, one rooted in selflessness and the service to others. The model of Jesus, who sacrificed himself for humanity, set a new ideal of moral heroism based on compassion rather than conquest. Most all of us have these sensibilities of we need to care for the poor. It did not come from the ancient Romans. It came from the man from Galilee. How about this? The value of the individual. In Roman society, individuals were valued according to their status, power, and usefulness to the state. By contrast, Christianity introduced the idea that every individual possesses inherent worth in the eyes of God. Some of you may know this quote, that God created the heavens and the earth, okay? And that God created humanity in God's likeness. There's a value in each and every individual. This was revolutionary in a society where slaves and the poor had almost no value. Mercy and forgiveness. Roman morality celebrated justice and often harsh punishment for enemies. Seeing mercy was a sign of weakness. Christianity taught the importance of forgiveness, mercy, love even for one's enemies, challenging the Roman norms of revenge and retribution. Are you seeing the difference? Are you catching up what's going on here? My friends, we today need a remembering of our history. Certainly, we need to know other people's cultures. We need to. It's a good thing. We need to know other histories. Those that, in fact, helpful about that is to know what other cultures' values come close to ours, if not mimic ours, and which ones don't. We need to be aware. But as the ancient Hebrews knew, as well as the early Christians, we must know our history first. Most Christians today, I'll take a chance here and say this, most of us are okay. We're all right with Adam and Eve being separated from the dinosaurs. Most of us are not worried about how people are dealing with evolution. Not at all. We can and do appreciate the knowledge and the wisdom of the ancient Greek philosophers and the playwrights. We are grateful for the developing of ancient Roman law. Much of it was good. I close. One more paragraph from Tom Holland. Today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in a post-Christian societies still take for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals, he says, and my ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. Let's start there. Amen. Please come back.